Hi, I'm Julie O'Dwyer. I am the chair for the Housing and Construction Subcommittee for the Jackson County Long-Term Recovery Group. I'm also a local architectural and interior designer, community member, vice president of the board of the Ashland Food Co-op, and I attend a lot of meetings. But I went down to Paradise earlier this summer by myself and also went to Santa Cruz and Sonoma and Napa and came back really kind of getting a really better understanding of kind of what disasters like after a fire and how the community pulls together, and suggested to some members of our long-term recovery group that we might want to do another visit down there at the end of this summer, just so that people could kind of get an understanding of where that community's at 3 years post fire, if there's things we can learn from them, but also really just to create a stronger connection to another fire affected community that is dealing with similar issues that we're dealing with. And so I was really lucky to have, there were 6 of us who went down. And it was amazing for everyone for lots of different reasons, lots of positives, lots of eye-opening experiences, lots of connections. And so as a result of that, we put together a document, which I've turned into a slideshow, and I wanted to just share that with everyone here, let people kind of know about what we learned down there. And I just want to do a caveat with that. What we learned doesn't mean that we're not doing it here. It just means that it's something that we recognize was very significant in their recovery. And whether or not we want to engage in those kind of ideas further or not is really up to our community. But we had some really important sort of eye-opening experiences. Our trip to Paradise, like I said, we learned an awful lot, but there's some things that I really want to make sure that the people here in Jackson County understand, that there are differences to the disaster that happened down there and the disaster that happened in our community. And it points out why some of their responses have been different, but also points out some of the things that are, I don't want to call them advantages, but things that we didn't have to deal with, which we need to be very grateful that fire recovery has actually moved forward quite a bit in the last 3 years. So one of the big differences is their amount of loss of population. They went from a town of around 27,000 to currently they're just around 6,000 residents. That is a huge loss of residents. And that doesn't even include all of the commercial properties that were destroyed. We were affected significantly. Certain communities were affected disproportionate than others, but we did not lose a vast majority of our population. Paradise also had absolutely no one who wasn't affected, and affected very directly and very overwhelmingly. Our fire, we definitely have a certain population that has been affected disproportionately, but there are a lot of people who really have moved on and that hasn't really affected them on a day-to-day basis. Paradise also had some significant infrastructure issues that really kind of intensified their recovery. And that included the fact that their city is fully on septic. There is no public sewer system. So every single piece of property that has to recover has to deal with recovering their septic system as well. But one of the things that they actually had an advantage over us, and which we struggle with day to day, and we're continuing to see spikes in it, is how to deal with living in a COVID affected community. They were able to almost immediately gather together in person, not only to think about ideas and figure out who's going to do what, but also really to give witness to what was being suffered and the trauma that was happening. We as a community have not really been able to have a lot of opportunities to do that. And I think that's one reason why our recovery has a little bit of a jilted start to it. And there's a little sort of progress forward and a few steps back. So whenever possible, I think that those are issues that we kind of need to address. After our visit, the group of us, 6 of us, kind of put together what we would refer to as sort of our highest level learnings. And these are not specific projects always, but really just our overall sense of what we came away from. The biggest one really being that there was a broad and deep community engagement that was critical for their recovery, but also critical for them being prepared to move forward. As many of you know, the Dixie Fire is affecting that community as we speak. And so for them to be able to have had those strong connections already in place, it gets them more prepared for ongoing disasters. Their recovery also had an amazing multi-jurisdictional complexity, which they really overcame. They really gathered together, both from the cities, the counties, as well as the towns that were around them, really to address this as a collective recovery. The other big learning that we had, and it was very obvious when we were there because the Dixie Fire was kind of blowing up as we were visiting Paradise, was that catastrophic wildfires are the new reality here in the West. This is not something that is a one and done kind of event. We are constantly going to be having to be affected by this. As many of you know, right now we're dealing with the smoke from other fires in the area. But again and again, wildfires are going to be at the top of the list of how do we prepare for moving forward as a community. One of the concrete learnings that we had that was at the highest level is we need what they refer to as a BRIC, which is a Building Resiliency Center. And this was a centralized community space where permitting, recovery, rebuilding, community support services, community organizations, all of the agencies were in one single spot for people to come to and really start to figure out how they were moving forward in their trauma. It was essential not only for their fast initial recovery, but for their ongoing rebuilding. And the disaster recovery actually really does need to address a lot of short-term needs rather quickly, but always with an intention for how it needs to correct systematic long-term issues. One of the unique things about what we've witnessed in Paradise is how their long-term recovery transformed at about 18 months to 2 years after their disaster into what they refer to as the Campfire Collaborative or Collective. And this is really, it was a similar structure to our LTRG, but really moving on to much more long-term systematic issues within the community. And I think it's something that as we develop the R3V, we need to think about how do we start to make that transition so that it's supportive for not only individual assistance, but also public assistance. This is the group that went down there. This is what some of our FEMA hosts, which we have to say were just absolutely amazing. One of the things that they did was they gave us a binder that was sort of a summary of all the things that they had learned, resources they had developed, or that the community had developed in their recovery. And it's really a great book to kind of take a look at how can we take some of those things and put them into our recovery. To kind of narrow down what some of the key learnings are, and I'm going to go through these key learnings and then also what I would refer to as just some interesting, unique projects that we learned down there. And these are in a lot of ways sort of what we see as sort of in the highest level and the highest importance. So 211 was a service that they utilized almost from day one. And with this service, they were able for 211 to connect people directly into what was going to become their long-term recovery group. They were able to do needs assessment and actually get data on those people from day one. And then as they've moved through their recovery, continuing to have a single source of information for the entire community, as well as for people who were moving back into the community who hadn't been there before. And also, like I said, for the preparedness when they've had additional wildfire issues moving through that community. Their Building Resiliency Center, I can't stress enough how much we were just amazingly overwhelmed by this facility and the folks that are there. It truly was a coming together of all the different jurisdictions and organizations in a way where they really collectively tried to support each other's missions and goals, but also to make sure that there was not a whole lot of duplication of effort so that people didn't feel overwhelmed in how they had to go through their recovery process. Philanthropy was at their table and at all of their tables in their long-term recovery group. So not just in donations and giving, but also in their building and construction, in their economic recovery, in their needs assessment, in their disaster case management, so that really those donors, and both private and public donors, really understood the complexity of those recovery issues and were able to actually meet those needs in kind of unique ways, not necessarily always with money, but sometimes with shared services, shared support, or just information on how to connect people. This was their Building Recovery Center. It was a former bank that had been closed down prior to the fire. And so after the fire, Bank of America said, just take it, have it, use it as you wish, which is a wonderful gesture. But it really gave a space for people to gather. The other thing we wanted to note was the woman who was at the front desk, I believe her name was Kelly, I can't remember, I apologize, having a cheery, wonderful, welcoming face when you first walk in. It shifted everyone's perspective. It also allowed people to really have someone to just check in with about sort of the simple questions, so that it didn't bog down a lot of the people who were there from different agencies, but just someone who could answer some simple questions and keep the process moving forward. Crisis counselors were provided through FEMA for the disaster. And this was really important for their community, not only to address the trauma of the fire victims, but also really the mental health issues that were coming from the caregivers and the responders. With such a long-term recovery, those sort of mental health issues don't always show up right away. And so often people who are sort of the caregivers don't take the time to take care of themselves. And so having that kind of crisis counseling in place for the community really allowed those caregivers to continue to come back over and over and over again and stay involved in the recovery. Public gathering was something that they embraced before COVID, during COVID, and even when we were down there, we were lucky enough to actually be part of a public gathering called Paradise Party in the Park. So important that people actually got to see their neighbors, to make sort of that face-to-face contact with each other and understand and share the trauma and the struggles that they were going through, but also to really celebrate the things that were going really right. They were mentioning that their Paradise Party in the Park before the fire, the amount of people that showed up was not even half as many. And just the fact that they have a shared experience makes people want to gather together and find something to celebrate. The other really interesting thing is the idea of doing an after action report that really engages the community-based organization. So the people that were on the ground, a lot of those organizations which came up out of nowhere, were grassroots, didn't have an established organization prior to the fire, but really were there just to address the immediate needs. They have so much information for us to learn from about really what are those initial things that need to be dealt with, but also what are some of the systematic issues that they were trying to address from day one. This was the beautiful Paradise Party in the Park. It was so exciting to be able to see people out eating, having a nice glass of wine, dancing, and just enjoying each other. We were so happy that we could coincide our visit with this party. Crossing jurisdictions, that was really key to their recovery. They had a very separate city organization compared to their county organization, but after the fire, those jurisdictions really blended together to support each other, to make sure that there wasn't too much crossover, but also they were able to support each other with services and information. Construction skills are something that as a community, we need now, and we're going to need for a long time. So how do we start to integrate those kind of workforce skills into our community to provide jobs, to provide additional building support, to raise those folks who are already in the construction industry, potentially up to a higher level through additional certification or additional knowledge, but just making sure that we look at that as an entire ecosystem, because this rebuild will take years and we need labor to do that. Missing middle grants were something that I had not heard of before knowing about Paradise. And it was really about trying to find those small areas within the recovery process that if just giving just a little bit of money, just a little bit of effort to some individual family could get them to recover a little bit faster. So that could be grants for the cost of permitting, that could be special services to provide additional zoning issues. It could be for taking care of your septic because they had so many septic issues, but just what are those critical things that sometimes get lost in the costing of rebuilding? How can a community support those through granting? And that is either through public or private funding, but really making sure that you're doing whatever you can to just move the people further down the line to rebuilding. Supporting small businesses is going to be very important, not only for Paradise, but also in our community. We did have a lot of small businesses who lost their property, their buildings, and also now with the loss of population, a lot of their business. And so in as many ways as possible, how we can support them to recover, to revitalize, to bring the workforce back, and to make the communities a place that people want to be. And one of the ways that this became a focus for them was one of the committees that they added to their long-term recovery group was an economic and workforce committee. We've had a unique additional committee by adding an equity committee to our long-term recovery group, but the idea of the long-term recovery group focused on workforce and economic issues from day one, I think is really kind of interesting, and has allowed them to have those always as part of their long-term goals. This was a photo from the Campfire Collaborative. We were lucky to be there during their monthly meeting. They had not had an in-person monthly meeting for almost a year. In the room were probably 40 individuals from a variety of different community-based organizations, jurisdictions, interested parties, and then probably another 40 that were online on a Zoom call. This shows the depth of community engagement that has continued to happen for them 3 years out. Not necessarily always the same faces, but definitely the same organizations. Just keep showing up at the table, keep trying to move things forward, and keep trying to work on the recovery. The Campfire Collaborative is organized slightly different than a long-term recovery group, where each committee has a chair, and then the entire organization is really managed through a council of chairs. So those chairs really kind of keep the projects or the mission or the ideas moving forward, and then the actual committees are the ones who are doing that work. Important in the support that we address everyone. And we've got a lot of people who've been affected by the fire by losing their homes. We've got a lot of people who've been affected by the fire because they've lost their business. They're having to drive through the area on a daily basis. But also the idea of how do we support new people coming in, I think was really unique. The idea that we need to move beyond just those that were specifically affected by the fire, but trying to rebuild that community as a whole. Again, like I mentioned, the structure of a council of chairs was really interesting. It really centered the work on some very specific ideas and around some really specific focuses. Open sourcing as many resources as possible, and that can be anything from building libraries to public permitting to forms, but as much as possible, making it easy for people to share that information, share surveying information, share information about how things are done for insurance, whatever that might be. Opening it up as much as possible really allowed the recovery to happen. And then really looking at the regional planning overall, and that's not just from the perspective of zoning, but also really how is the community going to recover and continue to be resilient. And so one of the ways that Paradise really addressed this is in their recovery planning, looking at areas for evacuation zones, for providing additional defensible space. And this could be things like parks, but they also have opportunities where they have private easements across private land to allow for those defensible spaces to stay open to the public in the case of an additional wildfire. When we talk about the Resiliency Center, one of the unique things that they have is what was called a Rebuild Advocate. And this Rebuild Advocate was really a layperson's guide. Those of us in the construction industry have our own lingo and our own jargon, and then there's all of the jurisdictions and all of the acronyms that they have, and it can be amazingly overwhelming for someone this is the first time that they've had to go down this path, or even if they've done it several times. And so being able to step back and look at the build process from a layperson's perspective and really start to narrow things down into sort of manageable, smaller steps, manageable, smaller bits of information, and get people to continue to move that forward versus dumping all of that information at one time, and having someone that they can personally check back in with as they're having to move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction or department to department, or from the architect to the engineer to the civil to whomever, but just having one person that they can really ask, like, what is that thing that they're talking about. Developing a community recovery plan was very important, especially with regard to how we're going to develop future funding resources. So really the entire community as a whole, how we want to recover. And one of the biggest things is just a clear acknowledgement that the relationship of the community was redefined overnight. As Stephen pointed out in his opening verbiage, it changes everything, and we can make it change something for the better, which I think is very important. Some of the unique ideas, and I'm just going to go through these real quickly. We'd love to, if there's any of them here that you're interested in, we can definitely connect you in with folks down in Paradise who were actually kind of spearheading this. So public alert systems that are widespread and normalized, and that includes things like sirens as well as social media notifications. Trying to pull in AmeriCorps volunteers. For them, it was not only with their DCMs, but also with some rebuild efforts. FEMA actually was asked to forward audit requests to their long-term recovery group, which allowed that long-term recovery group to really be able to follow up with that person and make sure that if there was additional needs that they have because of the audit or clarification, they were right on them and didn't have to wait for the people to come to the long-term recovery group. Expanding the rebuild effort beyond the burn scar. Not just the burned area has been affected by the disaster. And so how do we actually take a look at the community as a whole? Business support using the collective impact model that really supports the workforce. Creating a centralized bulletin board. We, in the age of COVID, have made a lot of things online, which is wonderful, but there's a lot of people where that just doesn't work for them. And so not only having multiple ways to get information to people, but having that physical place to go to. So many people down in Paradise acknowledge the fact that it created a sense of community, that there was an actual physical place they could go to check in for information. They created a rebuilding loan program for private funding to help people rebuild both from a commercial as well as residential rebuilding. An emergency housing database, and this was developed so that in future fires or future disasters, immediate housing could be found for people so that people didn't feel like they were just kind of lost amongst the trauma. They created a property swap program so that folks from one community to another could swap pieces of land in a little bit more of a clear pathway. So that, again, if there were folks who wanted to come back to the burn scar area, they were really supported to do that. Providing home hardening grants. This sort of is, again, another one of those sort of missing middle grants is how do you build back in a way that's going to be more resilient, knowing that catastrophic wildfires are in our future. As much and as quickly as possible, engaging with the GSA sales for both RVs, trailers, and mobile modular homes. I'm really glad to hear Alex Campbell announce that that is actually moving forward rather quickly. So it's a great opportunity to provide really quick housing for a significant amount of people. And as quickly as possible, we need to engage in that. And then also support those people, because those housing sources are not necessarily meant to be permanent. So how can we strengthen them, harden them, and improve them so that they can be permanent housing that enriches the community? Again, a building advocate as a layman's partner in this whole thing was super important. Developing a housing plan library. This is actually something that we're going to be engaged in, our housing and construction subcommittee, starting September 2nd. We're going to be having a presentation from Charles Brooks, who's going to talk about how they've set up a housing plan library, and the Southern Oregon American Institute of Architects chapter is interested in engaging in that process as well, to develop a set of sort of standardized plans that are pre-approved, pre-engineered, and really allow people to get building as quickly as possible for as little money as possible. Engaging volunteer build organizations. We haven't done a whole lot of that. Habitat for Humanity is obviously one that's here, but there are lots of other ones that travel around the country to help people rebuild their homes. A chief storyteller is an idea that I know that this group has talked about, but what was really unique in Paradise is not only did Rebuild Paradise have a chief storyteller who told their story, but they actually lent that storyteller out to other community-based organizations so that those community-based organizations could expand their capacity of how they could explain the story of how they're doing and how they're recovering. The quote that nothing about us without us was super important, and we heard over and over and over again. It's so important that those people that are affected by the fire are part of this recovery. They celebrate every rebuild, every accomplishment, every permit, every new business, and they do it vocally, they do it visually, they make a huge celebration out of it. It's important that we start to move towards the positive. Looking at mobile housing to address reoccurring fires. How can we live in this kind of an environment on an ongoing way and allow people to recover and not constantly be burned down? They also separated their unmet needs into a simple unmet needs committee and a complex unmet needs committee. And that was divided based on the value of the unmet need. And it allowed those simple unmet needs to be answered really quickly and really efficiently. And the more complex one was really where they had to dig into the information and create a sort of whole package on how to handle those. And last but not least, this is our group at this amazing cave that one of our Paradise residents let us come and hang out with. It was actually survived the fire and has now been turned into quite an entertaining space. And we were lucky enough to hang out, have pizza and drink wine and get to know each other even more. So I'd like to end it with just saying this was organized for us to introduce and share face-to-face with communities affected by wildfire. I want to thank the entire community of Paradise for their warm welcome that we received, the information that they shared, and the open hearts that they presented. The learnings that we gathered were both important for the further development of the Jackson County Long-Term Recovery Group and the recovery for a better and more resilient community. I'd like to close it with a beautiful haiku that Marta created on our trip. Some new acronyms, new faces, new stories inspire. Char didn't prevail here. Thank you all so much, and I hope this leads to some new interesting ideas.